Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bill Even, your CEO at the National Pork Board here in Des Moines, Iowa. Wanting to welcome you to our August Pork Producer webinar. As you may recall, we did a number of these on a weekly basis back during the spring, during the height of the COVID pandemic, and took a break over the summer to kind of give everybody a little bit of a break. And I heard from a lot of producers that they really appreciated getting this information, things that are top of mind for them. And so we're pleased to restart these pork producer webinars. Our plans are to do these at least once a month based on topics that we're hearing from you out in the field and from allied industry and from the processing industry as well. So with that, you can go to the next slide. So in keeping with our antitrust policy, I just wanted to remind everybody on the call today that the National Pork Board does take antitrust issues very seriously, both our board of directors or the work that we're doing presenting this information. And so we wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance to see that. And in addition, these slides will be available for all of the attendees after the session. And I believe this session is being recorded as well. Is that correct, Nate or Claire?
That is correct.
Very good, thank you. So we have an opportunity to share this with others, other colleagues and so forth, if they're not able to join this afternoon and get this important information. So on the next slide, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. Myself, CEO at the National Pork Board. We're going to next hear from Angie Krieger, Vice President of Domestic Marketing at the National Pork Board. She's going to hand it off to Dr. Clay Eastwood, who's the Director of International Marketing at the Pork Board. And then we're going to close with a presentation from Dr. Steve Meyer, economist at Kerns and Associates. And with that, I will turn it over to Angie.
Thanks, Bill, and good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. I'm grateful to have a few minutes of your time this afternoon to talk about our domestic marketing activities at the National Pork Board, and most specifically the new master brand that we're getting ready to launch called Real Pork. So Nate, if you turn to the next slide, this slide has garnered some attention within the industry, and you will see it a lot. It is our scorecard. It's sombering, to say the least, and so as I've presented it several times over this summer, I've started to think about it a little bit differently. Some producers have asked us, about the position that pork has. And frankly, the way I look at this slide is kind of like my bathroom scale. So we've all known for several years that pork demand has been sluggish, to say the least, in the United States. We've worked really hard and had some great campaigns, but over the last couple years, through investment in consumer insights, we were able to find out exactly where we were. And so much like anyone who decides to go on a diet, that first time you step on the scale, sometimes it's not exactly what you'd like to see. But the good news about having this scorecard is our team here now knows where we are, and we are poised to change those positions, which are frankly unacceptable. If you go to the next slide, Nate, I can show you that we've already made some progress. So this is really exciting news. After we did our initial scorecard, now we are doing quarterly trackers to see where we stand with consumers on those categories that you saw back there, which are the things that we know are important to them. And in the last quarter, pork was the only protein that consumers indicated they want to purchase more of during the second quarter. That's great news. It builds on the momentum that we know that we have during COVID, as sales have been very strong. So Nate, if you move to the next slide, just an idea of where we were pre-pandemic. So when we looked back to March, we were falling behind last year's pace a little bit. But as we look now at mid-year of 2020, we're up 25% in dollars at retail and up 17% in pounds at retail. I do get asked a lot about our focus on retail sales, and so I want to take just a second to talk about that. We all know that food service has been dramatically affected by COVID, and no doubt we've had products that have not been able to be sold through that channel. However, for fresh pork, retail is a very, very important marketplace for us. So this is really encouraging news. We have more consumers today who have eaten pork in the last month than maybe at any time in history. And we are poised to take advantage of that. Nate, if you'll go to the next slide. This real pork strategy that I'm going to tell you about is deeply rooted in insights and research. And so these are some metrics that we continue to look at, but some that I'd like to point out to you. One in the lower left-hand corner in the orange box, 73% of carnivores, so you all know that's meat eaters, and 63% of omnivores, so people who really like focus on getting a good variety of both meat and vegetables in their diet. We call them flexitarians sometimes. They agree that real meat is the best source of protein. We also know that 38% of people want to know more about the farm their meat came from, and 60% of consumers say that farmers are on my side when it comes to helping me stay healthy. So we're going to give them what they're asking for. They're calling for real pork, and if Nate, you'll move to the next slide, I'll unveil to you all our new master brand, Real Pork. As we look at real pork, this is going to be integrated into everything the pork board does. So this is not a new tagline. That really cool logo that you see there will be our campaign logo for this fall, but we're going to stay deeply rooted in the blue pork pick. That is who we are, and it's who we will remain. But we want to make sure that real pork is part of everything that we do, from telling the story of the farm to inspiring our consumers to enjoy pork in new ways. So this is not a short-term strategy. Certainly we want to provoke people to crave pork. We will be reimagining Good For You and working very closely with our Director of Nutrition and Dietetics to come up with a fantastic nutrition strategy for next year. But we're also really working to modernize our position and focus on younger consumers. Research shows that consumers form most of their cooking habits when they're in their late teens or young adults. And so you'll see a different look and feel to pork.org this fall, as well as we really try to target that consumer demographic. You can go to the next slide now, Nate, and I'll talk a little bit about what real success looks like in these areas. So again, for consumers, we want to make sure consumers are considering pork as a protein option. As we did shop-alongs last fall, it was very disappointing that a lot of consumers didn't have pork on their shopping lists. When we talked to them about pork, they would say how much they enjoyed the product, and yeah, I should eat that more. But we want it to be top of the list every time they go. We want to convert them from other forms of protein, not just alternative proteins, but also our other competitors in the protein space. Certainly there's a lot of competition in that meat case, and pork is a wonderful flavor base for any kind of cuisine, and consumers sometimes just don't think about us as an option. We're going to make sure that they do. Through all this, we will increase pork consumption and really create a new consumer mindset and emotions towards pork. What does that mean for you as producers? Well, frankly, we'd like you to feel re-energized about this after a challenging year. My team and the domestic marketing team, we've worked very hard to keep products moving at a time that I know has been very difficult for you all on farm. And we hope that Real Pork will show you that the future is bright for our products. The momentum that we have seen through COVID can certainly be continued, and we seek to do that. In retail, we're working with our retailers to make sure we keep those pork sales strong and that we're poised for long-term growth. And then we do also have a very robust strategy around food service. Certainly food service has changed and will likely continue to change. So when we're talking about things like ghost kitchens and street food and delivery services that are different than how they've looked in the past, we want to make sure that pork is on those menus. So that is Real Pork, and I'm excited. I hope you'll be hearing a lot about it, but One more thing that I want to touch on before I turn it over to Dr. Eastwood is ground pork. So you all may have heard in the last couple of weeks, we've been talking a lot about our strategy around ground pork, but this is really truly something to celebrate, and a category that I know has been beloved by pork producers for many years. We think of it often as the pork burger. Our consumers are thinking about it differently. We have seen fantastic growth since early March, 22% growth still in recent weeks, and I just got the most recent report, and we are still holding very strong with that growth. The really great news here is 45% of ground pork shoppers had not purchased pork or ground pork in the previous 12 months, and they're likely to purchase the product again. So we've got a bunch of new people to this category, and just a fantastic opportunity for us to provide them with even more ideas for how they utilize ground pork at home. So we're taking this business case to market. We're working with several retailers and a couple key packers right now, and it's our team's focus and goal to grow ground pork's share of the meat case throughout the rest of 2020 and into 2021. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Eastwood. She's going to talk about all the great things that we have going on in our export marketing programs.
Thank you, Angie, and good afternoon, everyone. Nate, could you go to the next slide, please? So like Angie said, switching gears just a little bit, want to spend a few minutes talking about exports and international marketing at the Pork Checkoff. So just to give a quick snapshot of where we are with current data, which has us through June of this year. June exports of U.S. pork actually fell below year-ago levels for the first time this year, but do still remain on a record pace for 2020. Exports in June were down 3% by volume from a year ago, but we're still up 24% by volume and 29% by value year to date. Exports continued to trend higher than a year ago to China and Hong Kong, but were the lowest since October of 2019, while exports trended lower to Mexico, Japan, Korea, and South America, in part due to product availability as a result of processing slowdowns and market volatility and buying seasonality. Pork exports did, however, increase year over year to the ASEAN region, so places like Vietnam and the Philippines, the Caribbean, Honduras, and Taiwan. Exports continue to remain steady with a year ago to markets like Canada. We do see that the weekly export data suggests an upward trend in demand in most of our markets, and with production recovering, the U.S. is very well positioned to regain momentum in the second half of the year. Next slide, please. China's moderating pork demand really highlights the importance of diversity and opportunities for us in the U.S. pork industry. In 2019, the Pork Checkoff conducted a market assessment in China, and it really aimed at delivering actionable insights to the industry. We know that in 2014, China's pork market peaked. In 2018, ASF began and has created a significant protein gap in the world's largest protein market. In the next 5 to 7 years, we see that China really aims to rebuild their domestic industry and strives to become more self-sufficient. We also know that by 2030, or in 2030, there will be a population peak in China. And by 2040, we really will start to see that import squeeze into the Chinese market. So we know that opportunities exist for U.S. pork exports to fill primarily the short-term need for protein in China. However, we really want to focus on the diversity piece, and China will find a way to live with African swine fever. And exporters are really going to need to work to position U.S. pork and pork products as a supplier of choice for the longer term. As 2025 approaches, Chinese domestic production will work to rebound, and imports will be displaced while the government walks the fine line of investments being made in their own domestic industry and keeping those import prices accessible, or pork prices accessible to as many consumers as possible. Next slide, please. The Pork Checkoff, however, is very focused on building a long-term plan to balance our export business, minimize risk, and ultimately build value. We cannot rely solely on China's demand for pork to last, so it's absolutely critical that we build a strong foundation of diverse countries and pork cuts to capitalize on the value growth into the future. At the Checkoff, we have 2 task forces this year, really focused on recapturing chilled pork market share in Japan and diversifying opportunities into Mexico. First off, for Japan, and largely as a result of the Japan and US bilateral trade agreement, and so once again, being on a level playing field with our competitors, the US has actually been able to regain some of the lost market share for chilled pork, primarily from our Canadian competitors. Another really bright spot for the US pork industry has been in the area of ground seasoned pork, commonly referred to as GSP, as exports to Japan have actually soared 60% to 175 million for the first half of 2020. And that just really brings a lot of added value back to boneless picnics here domestically. In Mexico, we're really excited about a program we have that's going to kick off this fall, where the Pork Board and USMEF are going to be hosting a customer seminar funded by Checkoff dollars, as well as USDA Foreign Agricultural Service Emerging Markets Program and Quality Samples Program funding. This is a technical seminar that's going to demonstrate not only new merchandising opportunities for loin primal items, but also will provide product samples to encourage trial in both retail and food service channels. So a really great opportunity for diversification of products into the Mexico market. And lastly, as a follow-up to our China market assessment, or our Pork 2040 work that I mentioned earlier, the Checkoff is conducting market assessments in both Vietnam as well as the Philippines, again using some of the USDA funding opportunities. These market assessments again aim to provide industry insights that will help us diversify opportunities and position US pork for long-term global success. We continue to work with our partners at USDA, USMEF, and the National Pork Producers Council to provide diverse and stable growth opportunities for US pork. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Meyer.
Thank you, Clay. Appreciate it. It's good to be with you, everyone. Good afternoon from Kerns and Associates Southern Region headquarters in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Actually, it's my office in my house. But anyway, that's what we'll call it. You'll go to the first slide here. Actually, I think you can skip through the title slide. Everybody knows that stuff. The second one is a disclaimer. We are an introducing broker for StoneX, which used to be FC Stone and Company. And as such, we do advise clients on futures and options trading. Those have some risk in them. This statement basically says that if you trade anything I say here today and lose money, it's your fault, not mine. So let's go to the next one. Let's talk about demand here real quickly. The measure that we've used for demand for several years, real per capita expenditures for pork, tells us in real terms, i.e. deflated dollar terms, what the value of purchases were by U.S. consumers at the consumer level. And they're all valued at the retail price, including food service purchases. And so this thing was terrible for a couple of months. And the reason, of course, is that per capita consumption went down sharply in April and May because we weren't slaughtering enough hogs. We have to remember that we don't measure consumption out there. We compute consumption based on production. And when production falls, we know exports, we know beginning and ending stocks in freezers. So the only thing that changes is how much we eat. And we certainly ate less in April and May because we had less to eat. June, another story. Much higher levels of slaughter, much more product available to us. In addition, we saw an increase in real price. We'll go to the next one. And when the price went up, the price times quantity means that an increase in real per capita expenditures. Now, on that last slide, you probably noticed that year to date, real per capita expenditures for pork is down 0.6%. That means it's almost exactly the same as it was a year ago after those wild fluctuations in April, May, and June. So this tells us that consumer level demand for pork is strong, even though we know that we've changed the channels where that pork is flowing dramatically. I mean, there's significantly less going through food service, there's more through retail, yet real per capita consumption and real price tells us that expenditures for pork are just about the same as they were a year ago. And I think that's terribly, greatly encouraging. And we'll get July data here on September 5th when we get the data for exports and imports for July, and we can then compute domestic disappearance or consumption I think that's probably going to be a positive number. So I think what we're seeing here is that while food service demand is certainly lacking, and I think we've got to get it recovered, if we look at the overall picture of how much U.S. consumers are eating and the price that they're paying for that, I think demand is still in pretty good shape. If we go to the next one, we talk about food service demand here. I think it's really important that we get this back. It wasn't the impacts of COVID have not been equal across segments. If we think about this for a minute, the white tablecloth restaurants have really taken a beating in this thing. And many of them live off of expense account purchases and entertainment and those kinds of things, special occasions. And plus, they can't get groups together. So all these things have worked against them and had a major impact on beef, especially in the short term. Hotels, think about the meetings that we've had in the past. This meeting might have been held in person, and we would have had a breakfast buffet this morning, and I'm sure all of you would have only eaten 3 pieces of bacon off of that breakfast buffet, right? Yeah, right. But those things haven't been held, and so I think that's going to be a drag, especially on breakfast again. And finally, the sit-down breakfast places, and I give the example here of Waffle House.
Nate, this is Bill Even, just checking to see if we lost Steve's connection.
Yes, it appears so.
Okay, let me try to get a hold of him. Stand by, folks. Sorry for this. Must be Oklahoma. Nate, Steve said he's going to be calling back in now.
Hey, Bill, I'm back in.
Perfect. All right. Well, Steve, where we lost you was you were just talking about the sit-down breakfast buffets and the amount of bacon we eat.
Thank you, Bill. Sorry, was it something I said? I don't know what happened. My phone just clicked and I was off. So must be a problem with Verizon service or something. I was talking about sit-down breakfast places. I mean, Pork owns the breakfast space and the breakfast day part, and we've always had a good trade with biscuits and McMuffins and those kinds of things. But when you shut down all of the breakfast places in town, you have an impact on pork that's disproportionate to other species, no question about that. And so I think this is something that's still a drag on pork demand. Even the ones that have opened back up can't operate at full capacity. And I use the Waffle House as an example. I know that Waffle House is Smithfield Foods' largest food service customer, and we know the nature of those buildings is not very amenable to this kind of situation with coronavirus, and especially the resurgent outbreaks across the South where they're predominant. We have Perkins restaurants in the upper Midwest. We have Denny's, IHOP, and those kinds of places. I think it's really critical we get them open back up. We're going to get pork food service back up and running where it has been in the past. Next slide, please. When we talk about exports, and Clay talked about it very well, I'm not going to belabor anything she said there. Obviously, June was a tough month relative to the prior months. And a big part of that was the resurgent U.S. consumption of product here. But if you look at what's happened here, and we go to the next slide, it shows you where we are by country. And exports this year is kind of all China all the time. And so we have to realize that that slowing that we've seen in China, and we've seen continued slowing in recent weeks of sales to China. is a big deal for our exports. At one time, we work a lot with Brett Stewart. He had about 33% growth for this year. He's backed that off to about 27, and my guess is, given what's happened to China, we're going to back that off some more. But we've also had, you can see shipments to Mexico down this year, shipments to Canada down. Korea has been down sharply this year, and so there's a number of markets that have slowed recently, but China has carried us so far. And if we go to the next one, we can see what happened on a weekly basis with the slowdown from up in the 15 to 20,000 metric ton level in March, April, and May, and now just bouncing around 10,000 metric tons every week going to China. So, they were the week of April 23rd. I think China took 14% of our production. In recent weeks, they've taken about 5%. So it's a significant reduction. Will that pick back up? There's some seasonality in the Chinese business as they go into the end of the year and prepare for their New Year's celebrations in January. We'll see what happens. There's so many things up in the air about this. If you look at price differentials, there should be pork flowing in massive quantities into China. Their prices are so much higher than anywhere else in the world that there really should be more product flowing there. But we think the government of China has decided that they're not going to become dependent on foreign supplies. They've decided to leave those prices and let private profits drive expansion of their herd to build back the number of animals that they have in China. And we hear a lot about, well, the sow herd is larger than it was a year ago finally, and the market herd is larger than it was a year ago. The problem is it doesn't mean that enough of those pigs are going to live to market weight. I still think they're pursuing the sea turtle strategy, where you dump all those baby sea turtles onto the shore, because if you put enough of them out there, a few of them are going to make it to the ocean. I think that's really the strategy on their hog situation. We know that the recent flooding in the Yangtze Valley has affected a large, sizable proportion of Chinese pork production, even larger portion, over half of their rice production. And the government of China has been completely silent about the impact on agriculture and food of those floods. And so I don't think we can ascribe very much of economic drivers to what goes on with China. Our exports there should be larger. They've made a decision not to buy. We go to the next one. This was week before last. Our cost model that was based on the Iowa State University parameters had cost of production in our model of about $59, a little less. Those have gone up a bit. They went up some today because of the condition report yesterday on corn, which dropped good to excellent ratings on corn by about 5%. We had an increase of 14 cents on soybeans and about 9 cents on corn today. And so these numbers have creeped up a bit. There's some discussion right now in the trade, and this was brought up last week at the NPIC webinar that I did, and Steve Weiss and I are talking more about it. We've always known that these Iowa State parameters were kind of low, and they were lower than the average. Back a few years ago when I worked with EMI, I got to see AgriStat's aggregated data, and it always ran about $5 higher than the Iowa State estimates. We thought that the difference there really was that the AgriStats data was representative of average producers, and probably Lee's modeling had resulted in kind of the best 25%. And so that's what I've ascribed that to. Steve brought up last week that some data that they have says that the best 25% would be higher than this by $3 or $4, maybe $5. So we're doing some work on that, but I think it's safe to say that the average cost is somewhere in the 60-63 range, probably. Of the best 25%. The average cost to be about $5 higher, somewhere in the mid 60s. And so still, if we look at the board for next year, it's averaged over $68. So there's still some things out there offering for us, but this year's corn crop has done remarkable things so far. The great windstorm that hit Iowa 2 weeks ago has certainly done some damage to that crop, but most of that product will be harvestable. The yields will probably be down on those acres, and it took some of the best acres of the country and damaged them. But we're still going to have a large carryout of 2.5, maybe even 3 billion bushels of corn. 500 million or so for soybeans. These costs are not going to get out of hand here, even though they might not be quite as low as depicted in this chart. We'll get this kind of reconciled, and Dr. Lee Schultz and I and some others will work on this. If these are too low, we'll certainly get them changed. We go to the next and they'll get into the supply side. And the supply side talks about, we're going to start with the June hogs and pigs report. This thing was way out there. We didn't know what to expect. We knew we were going to have a whole bunch of heavy hogs that had been backed up on farms, that had been held for a while. We didn't know it's as of June 1, the inventories. But there were a number of kind of surprises. Number one is all hogs and pigs was 1.5% larger than what we thought. That was all in the market herd, basically. The breeding herd didn't go down quite as much as we thought, even though, it was manageable, 0.6% difference. But it dropped, about 80,000 in the quarter down to 6.3 million. If we look at the inventories in the weight categories, the big surprise was the 120, 179s. We knew there were going to be a lot more 180 and over because those hogs were being held, but we didn't kind of really plan on 120 to 179s maybe growing because maybe they were being held as well. But it makes sense that you're going to hold more of those hogs than just the ones that are ready for market. And so that was a bigger number. Now, notice that the 180 over number was actually smaller than what the USDA, what the analysts had thought it was going to be, and we thought that one was a little bit low. So, we can all argue about that one because it's very difficult to predict these when people aren't feeding hogs to grow as they normally feed hogs to grow. And that's what they've been doing. If we get down to the farrowing intentions, our first blush at farrowing intentions was that, wow, those June, August numbers, and those are way too low. After I did my calculations, I'm about 1% larger on both of them. So I'm not too far off on that. And then, of course, the March, May pig crop was larger than a year ago. Analysts had expected it to be smaller because of euthanasia, and because of that same reason, March, May, say per litter was actually slightly larger when analysts had expected to be smaller. So this was a bearish report from the beginning. If we go to the next one, I can show you what our projections for slaughter are in the gray shaded area here. The two columns to the left, Iowa State Livestock Marketing Information Center, are slaughter projections on the same basis as ours. The one right in the middle is the USDA WASDE, and it is pork production in billion pounds. You should watch the percentage change numbers to compare here. And you can see our percentage change numbers are kind of all over the map. Now, USDA is kind of tied to the hogs and pigs report, and they, because of internal you got to agree internally, they can't do a lot of playing with that fourth quarter number. If the pigs report says that's what it's going to be, that's what it's going to be. In our case, we're not allowing our slaughter to go up in the fourth quarter to reflect the pig report because we don't think we got capacity to get it done. So our number of 33.109 million head in the fourth quarter, down 5.5% from a year ago, is not a number based on the number of pigs out there. It's based on the number of shackle spaces that we think are going to be operable. And then in the first quarter of 2021, we have a large pickup of that because we think we're going to push some hogs all the way back into that first quarter. So our slaughter isn't down as much as the other analysts would have going forward on that. But still, when you add it up, we still end up with more pigs next year in the slaughter than what we have this year, largely because we don't see a big decline in the first quarter due to pigs getting pushed back. And so that brings us to this next slide. And the topic of the day and the topic of most days in the last 3 months has been, how many hogs can we kill? We've tracked this operational capacity and idle capacity thing daily for about 2 months and then weekly for the last month or so. And we're finally getting better. I mean, we're finally getting back less than 5% idle. We were down to 3.6% this week. That's the best we've been all year. Only 3 of the 28 plants running below, and these are the 28 that had troubles. There are other plants out there, obviously, but these are the ones that really had troubles at some point in the process. There are only 3 below 90% now. The Rantoul, Illinois, Agar Foods, Tar Heel, North Carolina is the big one that's had troubles. And then, of course, the Gwaltney plant at Smithfield plant at Gwaltney, Virginia. Those are the 3 that are really the laggards here. their limitations aren't really not coronavirus related at this point. It's just getting people to work and getting labor in the plant. The problems are fewer and shorter lived. A lot of questions about, well, what's going to happen this fall? And of course, you know, we're reading stories about back to school, and we have some blow-ups of coronavirus in some places, and schools going virtual and colleges going virtual. So I think we're going to have some of that, but I think I'm pretty optimistic about this because first and foremost, we're just not as ignorant as we were on March 1st. We know something about this virus. We know something about what we need to do. Second, since we've had so many infections in our plants, we also have more immunities in our plants. And so that should help us avoid massive problems this fall. And finally, again, the workforce is not a naive population. So, you know, I don't think we're going to have a huge impact all at once, a big wave of problems, and 8 plants down and 40% of our capacity down like we did in the fall. If we go to the next one, you can see the graphic presentation of idle capacity. It peaked back in late April, early May, and then just kind of steady progress until recently we've been bouncing around 5%, and then the last 2 weeks below 5%, which that's encouraging. I don't think we'll stay there week in, week out as we go through the fall. And that brings us to our next slide, which is probably the most important thing that I'm going to share with you today. And there's a lot of discussion about this slide, okay? Number one is the red line, fall 2019 packing capacity. It has increased just a bit from that 2.755 million head. We've got a new plant open in Laverne, Minnesota. They can kill about 2,300 per day. They're not slaughtering that many yet, but that's an addition. But we've also have some capacity that has not been available to us. And so the green line represents 95% of last year's barrel and gilt capacity plus all of our sow capacity. We haven't had a lot of problems at sow plants, so I'm going to put them in full and allow that, and say 5.4 days per week would give us 2.621 million. Now, we've run a little over that recently, so 2.675 last week, or 75 this week, 2.563 or so last week. But you can see that the actuals, which is the red line with the diamonds that took the big dip back in April, have been running very, very close to our forecast, which is the red smooth line. The aqua colored line here is what would be slaughter if the USDA year-over-year percentage changes in each of the weight categories applied, and if those hogs were growing normally, and if we had sufficient packing space to slaughter them. So you can see that we have not slaughtered hogs in that population on June 1st. We have not slaughtered nearly as many hogs as that population, that inventory would have suggested we would slaughter had they been growing normally and we had the place to do it. In fact, the difference between the actual slaughter and that aqua colored line in this chart now amounts to 1.4 million pigs. Now, there's a raging debate about, are we current? A lot of people say, well, we're current. And there are producers that are current, no question about that. But if the industry is current, then you tell me what happened to that 1.4 million pigs. We haven't heard about them being euthanized. We have heard in recent weeks of more euthanization of small pigs again, which we had speculated 3 months ago was going to happen because we double and triple stock barns back here in April and May, and at some point you had to get those pigs spread out. That took barns that were being freed up by market hogs that you normally would have put the next group of wean pigs into. And so it's that group of wean pigs that we hear, and we've heard anywhere from 200 to 400,000 over the last 6 or 8 weeks. That will have an impact on our supplies when we get to November and December. It doesn't have an impact on the front end. So while weights have been behaving quite normally, if we go to the next slide, and this is the slide that most people base their claims that we're current on, that we've kept pulling down weights. So, well, if we got all these extra hogs, why aren't they getting heavier? Well, because we're not feeding them to get heavier, and they've been on controlled diets, and we've had whole barn dumps, which you know, when you empty a barn, instead of emptying it in 3 or 4 weeks, you empty it in 1 week because you've got to have the space. It gives a lot of light hogs into the mix. And so we think there are just simply more pigs out there at all these weights, especially toward the upper end of the distribution. We think that they're going to show up eventually. That number of backlogged hogs stands at 1.4 million. It won't get much worse in September, but beginning in October, if we can only run 95%, we're going to add to that thing virtually every week and be up to close to 3 million by the end of the year. Now, running at 97 or 98% will keep that number much more in hand, but it won't allow us to catch up any in the fourth quarter because supplies are going to be so large. So it's a quandary. It's a tough situation for the industry, but the best we can do is get through it. I have to tell you, I've been so impressed by producers' resourcefulness and nutritionists' resourcefulness in holding these hogs. Back when this thing started, I made some headlines predicting we were going to have to euthanize 8 million pigs. I never thought we could hold them the way we've done. And so that kudos to producers and their advisors for figuring out a way to do that. But we still got a backlog of hogs, in my opinion, that is sizable that we have to work through. Go to the next one. The impact of this, of course, on this year is to severely reduce per capita availability. Not only is production production's not growing much this year, it was going to grow substantially. Then we've exported more product, and so we've reduced per capita availability down below 50 pounds. We think even with higher production next year, higher slaughter next year, we could see some export growth increase, some export growth, and a larger population that would pull it down slightly more. So our per cap offerings are back in a range where we can price this product reasonably well going forward if we can get a system to get the hogs through and get that product delivered. Next slide, please. So what do we think about cutout values? Well, the cutout values obviously had a wild ride. It was under lots of pressure early on because we had more food service product than we could get rid of. It put a lot of pressure on product. And then when the slaughter reduction started, we shorted the market severely and drove the cutout value, not to record highs, but pretty close, up above $110 for a couple of weeks. And then as slaughter started picking up, we put more and more product on the market. And as we've gone through the summer, our slaughter has been much larger than a normal summer level of slaughter, and we've kept this cutout value down all the way down in the 60s. Nice rally the last couple of weeks that we really didn't expect. We thought we were going to spend most of the month of August in about the 70 range. Of course, last week we're up in about the 74, 75 range, and we think we're going to have some more pressure on this in the next few weeks because of these kind of late August surge of pigs that's going to put some pressure on this. But then the cutout value trading up into the mid to upper 80s as we go along. When year-over-year growth is less. I mean, we're going to be year-over-year lower on prices on supplies, but still even lower because of the disruptions on the demand side, lower than a year ago on the cutout value. If we look at the next slide, a model similar to that one that relates the national weighted average net price of hogs. Now, this is across all purchase methods. This is negotiated, swine pork market formula, other market formula, and other purchase arrangements. So it has all of them in there. This is the average price received for all the hogs slaughtered on a given day, or the average price paid by packers on that given day. And you can see, it took a big dip down in the low 50s here this summer. It's recovered some. We had a nice little gain last week. We think it's going to be on some pressure most of the rest of the year. I'm optimistic that we're going to get this up into the 60s here on the strength of the cutout value, because the cutout value has a direct influence on this through swine pork market formulas. And then obviously it gives packers some reason to bid more for hogs if it's higher. Now, my concern and a caveat I'm going to throw is if we stay at 95% of capacity, then it's going to be these negotiated hogs are going to be very low priced in the fourth quarter. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that the negotiated market has been a wreck all the way along. I mean, way down in the 20s, rallied into the 40s a few weeks ago. We're still in the upper 30s, but we don't think it's going to get much out of that range for the rest of the year. In fact, this price is what we economists would call indeterminate. I don't think there's a supply and demand function that's determining what this price is on a weekly basis, because packers could bid 40, or they could bid 30, or they could bid 20 and buy the same number of pigs. Those pigs that aren't covered under other pricing arrangements that have to move. And I think there's a lot of them still out there because of the backlog. And so we think this number is going to be just kind of indeterminate and stay low for the foreseeable future. And if we had this into 2021, you'd see this is very low in the first quarter of next year when we're trying to catch up on these hogs. This is the Armageddon on the negotiated market that we've warned about for a long, long time, and I don't know that it goes away. So it's going to drive a need for a new way to determine prices of hogs. We go to the next one. Packer gross margins, of course, went very high in May when hog prices went down and the cutout value went up dramatically. All right, they say, well, that's not fair. Well, it might not be fair, but not everything in life is fair. One point I will make. You only earn those margins on hogs that you killed. And so if the margin that week, gross margin, and remember that the only thing that's paid for out of that is the pig. They still have to pay all their health, their labor, all their plant costs, all their COVID costs now, okay, which is important to remember, increased wages, which most of them are paying now. So all of those have to come out of this margin. And in May, you only earned that margin on an animal that you slaughtered. So if your plant was sitting empty, you didn't get any of this gross margin. So we need to remember that. We need to take that into account as we judge this. We're back down a few dollars over the 5-year average, and I think we're going to see us stay kind of in that range for the foreseeable future. And I would argue that that's probably not an unfair kind of packer margin, given that their cost. And they are a middleman. They run off a margin. They can manage a margin more than can anyone at both ends of the economic system and the supply chain here. Being a middleman, they can play both ends, and so that's what they do. Their margins have increased here recently. That's one of the reasons we're getting higher slaughter, and they're working so hard to get the capacity back up and running. What does this mean for prices? The next slide gives our forecast of prices, and this is national net price. You have to remember that the negotiated price is going to be significantly lower than the price that we're forecasting here. And this price is going to have about a minus $6 basis or so to the CME Lean Hog Index because of the difference in those prices. And based on this last week, when I pulled these numbers, we think the fourth quarter CME Lean Hog futures are pretty fairly priced. We think that the ones for next year are offering great pricing opportunities for producers that can add to their revenue situation, or at least put a floor under their revenue situation for 2021. There are lots of strategies with options and futures here that producers should talk to their marketing advisors about getting in place on rallies. We've even got some of these futures contracts up over 676 today. So I think you need to be paying attention at least to the first and second quarter of 2021 on what the market is offering you. I think that's a way that you need to view the futures market. That's a buyer out there that's offering you a price for your animals during that time period. And there are a number of ways to take advantage of it. I'd encourage you to explore those. The next one, please. So profitability, again, based off of our cost model, which is under some criticism, would say that this year is a loser for the best 25% by $6 to $10, by $10 to $15 probably for the average producer. The 2021 would be profits, slight profits for the best 25%, and probably a break-even year for the average. That's what the futures market was offering on August 14th. That's going to be very close to where it is today. We think that it's, the thing you can take from this is there isn't a real strong signal to cut back when you've got a futures market that's offering this kind of margins. And even if you want to quibble with the level of them, it's not a big negative number. And you've got to have big negatives on these profits before you start getting a large response. Next one, please. And so that turns us to sow slaughter. Sow slaughter is certainly higher for the year. It's up about 12.5%. 220,000 more sows slaughtered this year, but we started out with a much larger breeding herd. So we should expect sow slaughter to be larger. In addition, a decent portion of those 220,000 were depops farms that are going to be repopulated. So they're not net losses here. So we have some reduction of the breeding herd, but if you go to the next one, historically, you have to get up to about 1.1% of the breeding herd, which is the red line here, before you see any real big reductions of the breeding herd. Now, we've seen a little bit, as I pointed out earlier. We're down about 80-some thousand from a year ago for the breeding herd. Pardon me, this is quarter-to-quarter change. And so, we're down about 80-some thousand. We've already started reducing that. I don't think that we've had a sow herd reduction that's large enough to have a big impact on output over the next year or so yet. I think we will. I think we'll get there, but 3 to 5% is probably going to catch it. We've been tracking the announced liquidations and reductions of the sow herd recently, and our numbers for the next year, if the ones we've gathered are all that are reduced, would put us in that 3 to 5% reduction of the sow herd. Now, we think it's going to grow a bit, but one of the points we'd make is look at the next one, and it says that the sow price has been within $1 of the same number. If you go to the next slide, please. The same number for 14 weeks, I believe there. Now, I've been around economics a long time, and you don't see prices stay that constant for that long. And so I think what's happened here is sows plants are running as fast as they want to. They've decided that $25 is the price, and if you want to bring them, fine. If you don't, they're okay too. They've got plenty. And so we haven't really maxed our sow slaughter. We haven't got to capacity, but they've got plenty to meet demand on the other side of their plants. Normally, we get some help on sausage demand out of the start of school. And you can see this little blip up here in August on sow prices that normally happens. Well, that really hasn't happened this year. So you can see our forecast for sow prices are kind of sideways for the rest of the year. I don't think there's an indication yet that we're reducing the sow herd dramatically. And if we go to the next one, it's going to take a dramatic reduction to get it because productivity just keeps going up. A 3 to 5% reduction in the sow herd will have very little impact on the pig crop, and it certainly won't have any impact on the pig crop for over a year. So I think we're very concerned that our supplies are going to remain large. We still have to have some reduction of sows. So summary, the next one, and Nate, you want to just click the bullet points right on up there. Retail and export demand are still strong. The problem is food service, and we still need to get it back. I think if we got food service back to normal, we would see exceptionally strong domestic demand. Feed costs, no problem at this point. This crop, even though it's been damaged a bit and we've got some dryness in some areas, we're still going to have a big crop. I don't think we're going to have costs that are going to get out of line. Productivity growth plus high health plus whole diets mean there's lots of pigs, even though the market weights are not saying that we're behind. Weights will limit production, but those whole diets add to hog numbers. The problem is operational packing capacity. I hope we can get past 95 on an ongoing basis. That's still the number I'm working with. We'll see if we can do that. Last week was encouraging. Big problems for hog values into 2021. We've got the backup near 3 million. We think it will take into early April to work through those. And finally, losses will push some producers out and drive consolidation. Next slide, please. The recent announcements we've had have been kind of stunning. Hitch Pork, of course, announced a shutdown back in May. At that time, that was the largest liquidation that I knew of. We've had a lot of people get out of the hog business over the last 20 years, but in almost every case, their businesses were bought by someone else. This is a net reduction. The health, Hitch had health challenges. The location of their businesses, their farms and such, really made it a challenge for them, and they'd had those over the years. Their price was tied to the Western Corn Belt, and because of their location, they were pretty much they had one buyer, and that was Seaboard's plant out in Guyman. Goldsboro Milling announced they would wind down their operation. They've started that process. They've also filed a lawsuit against Smithfield. They've already ceased breeding sows. 50,000 sows. That's the largest liquidation ever. And this is an operation that had almost 100,000 sows about a year ago before they sold 40-some thousand to Hatfield up in Indiana. As far as we know, this was an operationally sound group. I mean, they did a pretty good job of everything that I know of, but their price was tied to the Western Corn Belt. And they'd made many efforts to change that. And, I've posed a couple of questions here, and I'll leave them could this be prevented? I'll let you decide that. And if so, what does this say about Smithfield's needs plans in North Carolina and the situation with China? Most of these hogs, I think virtually all of the Goldsboro hogs, went to the Gwaltney plant in Virginia, which was refitted for carcasses a year ago and then refitted again back to breaking carcasses this summer. So there's a lot of kind of nuanced messages there. The key factor in these, in my opinion, and I think it's going to be for some time, is going to be the pricing mechanism. We're going to see more and more producers that are tied to the Western Corn Belt that simply will not have enough revenue to stay in business over the next year or so. And I think it's going to be a critical situation that the industry has to resolve. Next one, please. Risks. On the negative side, the number one risk on the negative side is always a trade disrupting disease. We've sweated bullets over foot and mouth disease and African swine fever, and we're still free of those. At least we've never got them into pigs in the United States. But those concerns are now even larger. We're now at 29, bumping 30% of our production in export markets. So it's still a huge negative risk factor. Significant resurgence of COVID this fall. Is it already happening? We've been watching this very closely here with the university in Stillwater, and the case numbers have gone up, and we've been fortunate enough that our hospitalizations haven't gone up a lot, but this would be certainly a negative for our business. No long-term solution for COVID. I think we're all sitting here hoping and believing and having faith that we're going to have a vaccine for this disease at some point, and we can resume our lives reasonably normal. If that doesn't happen, and I remind you, these are very different viruses, but we thought the same thing at one time about the HIV virus, and we've never come up with a vaccine for it. This is a different cat. I understand that, but there's no guarantee you can come up with a vaccine for a virus. There's not a guarantee. Resumption of the trade war with China would certainly be a negative. You can say, well, did it ever end? I'm not sure it did. And so those would be the negative ones. And finally, no resolution to the food service sector's woes. That would make life more difficult. It'd certainly make it negative. But consumers are adapting. I mean, we pick up food from all kinds of places now, and ghost kitchens and all these kinds of things that are developing, and we're actually learning to cook at home. And that could have some long-term implications that are pretty important. Next one, positive risks. Number one is a coronavirus vaccine. We'd all go, never mind, and go on. China fills more of its pork gap with U.S. pork. I really don't think that's going to happen politically, depending on the election in November. The outcome of that might change this one. Dramatic turnaround for the economy. I think it's unlikely, because I think we've had some fundamental changes here of working at offices, of travel, of hotels, of those kinds of things. So I'm not sure we're going to have a dramatic recovery of GDP. I'll remind you that the stock market is not necessarily a measure of the economy. And finally, an immigration deal that expands U.S. labor supply. We had labor problems before we had coronavirus, and we still have labor problems, and we still need them solved. So that's what my thoughts for the day. Steve, Bill, we appreciate being included here. I would encourage producers listening out there to contact the Pork Board or contact us if you have any questions that we might be able to answer.
Well, thanks a million, Steve. Again, this is Bill Even, and really appreciate you taking the time to explain in great detail the information that our producers will need. If you go to the next slide, this is the last slide. Our 15-member board of directors has established an annual planning cycle, not a 5-year one, but an annual one, staying close to the producers that are paying the bills to make sure your money is spent where you want it. You see the red arrow there on the left-hand side of the screen. You guys are going to be part of many thousands of producers that are going to be receiving a survey from the National Pork Board here in the month of September. Pretty simple and straightforward, and it's designed to help you get your voice in. Where do you want your checkoff dollars spent? That's very important for the board of directors. So on the next slide, just want to close and thank all you folks for joining this webinar, and look forward to another one in September. Thanks much. and have a good day.